Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we talk about modern medicine, there is this fundamental assumption of teamwork.
Right, like a kind of unspoken social contract between everyone involved.
Exactly. Like a clinician prescribes a treatment, you follow the regimen as the patient, and everyone collaborates toward this shared goal of just getting you better.
Yeah, and that relies entirely on trust, right? Trust, agency, and cooperation.
But I was thinking, what happens when you step into a medical arena where that contract completely breaks down?
Oh, it gets complicated fast.
Yeah, a situation where the absolute best, most effective life-saving intervention is one that essentially removes trust from the equation entirely.
Wow.
One that physically locks the patient into their treatment and entirely strips away their ability to choose.
I mean, it forces a massive shift, right?
Yeah.
A shift from a therapeutic partnership to just enforced compliance.
Right.
Because when you look at the raw clinical data, especially in high-stakes chronic conditions, you realize that sometimes human psychology is actually the greatest obstacle to human biology.
That is such a heavy thought, but it's true.
It is. Taking away the patient's agency is occasionally the only statistically viable way to save their life.
And today we are looking at a massive global health challenge where this exact dynamic plays out, which is diabetic foot ulcers, or DFUs.
Yeah, the stakes here are just incredibly high.
They really are. We've got our hands on a comprehensive 2023 meta-analysis by Bin Lee and colleagues, and it pits two major treatment methodologies against each other in this head-to-head clinical battle.
And we should probably lay out the sheer scale of this issue for you before we get into the treatment.
Oh, absolutely. The global estimates suggest between 40 and 60 million people suffer from diabetic foot ulcers.
It's staggering.
It is. And if you develop one, you face a 20% lifetime risk of requiring a lower limb amputation.
Which is terrifying on its own.
But the statistic that really frames the severity here is the mortality rate. The 5-year mortality rate after a DFU-related amputation ranges from 50 to 70%.
Yeah, so we are definitely not just discussing podiatry or standard wound care here.
No, not at all. We are looking at an intervention designed to prevent catastrophic amputations and, frankly, death.
Right, and the clinical reality driving those mortality rates is this really complex cascade of physiological failures.
Walk us through that a bit. Why are these so hard to heal?
Well, diabetic foot ulcers are notoriously difficult because they usually arise from a combination of two things: peripheral neuropathy and vascular compromise.
Okay, so nerve damage and bad blood flow.
Exactly. High, unmanaged blood glucose levels over time will damage the distal nerves in the legs and feet. So the patient loses what we call protective sensation.
Meaning they literally just cannot feel pain in their feet.
Right. And simultaneously, vascular disease is restricting the blood flow, so it's depriving the tissue of the oxygen and nutrients it needs for cellular regeneration.
So a minor pressure point or a tiny scrape just goes completely unnoticed by the patient?
Exactly. And because of that lack of blood flow, it rapidly degenerates into a massive non-healing ulcer on the plantar surface, the bottom of the foot.
God, that's brutal. And with a 70% 5-year mortality rate post-amputation, clinicians obviously cannot rely on anecdotal evidence here.
No, absolutely not.
Or even just small, isolated trials. They need verified certainty to know the best way to offload pressure from these ulcers.
Which is exactly what this meta-analysis attempts to provide. They evaluated the global literature up until February 2023.
Right. They pulled data from Embase, the Cochrane Library, and PubMed.
Yeah, and they initially cast this huge net that caught 412 articles matching their criteria.
412.
Yeah.
That is a lot of papers to sift through.
Yeah.
But obviously they didn't use all of them, right?
Oh, no. Raw volume does not equal clinical truth.
Yeah.
I mean, a pool of 412 studies is just full of noise, varying methodologies, and potential biases.
So how did they filter it down?
They applied a highly restrictive, multi-layered filtering process. They had to strip away anything that couldn't hold up to really intense scrutiny. So, for example, they immediately excluded animal models because pig or mouse skin repair doesn't perfectly translate to a diabetic human foot.
Makes sense. What else got cut?
They threw out individual case reports and non-comparative studies. They needed a specific clinical face-off comparing total contact casts against removable offloading devices, and only in adult populations.
It's essentially a forensic data audit. It's like panning for gold.
That's a good way to look at it.
You have to wash away this absolute mountain of river dirt to find the heavy nuggets of absolute truth. And after running that gauntlet, only 12 studies survived.
Just 12.
Just 12 out of 412. But those 12 papers give us a highly concentrated, verified pool of 591 patients.
Right, which is a really solid sample size when the data is that clean.
Exactly. So that was 269 assigned to the permanent total contact cast group and 322 in the removable control group.
And the verification of those final 12 studies is where the real confidence in this meta-analysis comes from.
How do they verify the quality of those 12, though?
Well, for the randomized controlled trials, they utilize the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool,
Okay.
which evaluates things like random sequence generation. So ensuring the assignment of patients to the permanent or removable group was truly random.
Oh, right. So a doctor couldn't just subconsciously assign a healthier patient to their preferred treatment method?
Exactly, you have to remove that bias. And for the non-randomized cohort studies, they applied the Newcastle-Ottawa scale.
Right, the NS. That scale grades studies on selection, comparability, and outcome.
Yeah, so if a non-randomized study has terrible comparability, like, say, comparing 80-year-old heavy smokers in the permanent cast against 40-year-old athletes in the removable boots.
The scale flags it.
Exactly, the scale flags it. And the data is weighted accordingly or just thrown out.
Perfect. So we know the 591 patients in this pool represent a clean, structurally sound comparison.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's look at the actual interventions these patients receive. The primary one is the total contact cast, or TCC.
Right. The TCC has been in the clinical arsenal since roughly 1984. It's a knee-high, rigid device.
Usually made of fiberglass, right? Or a hybrid of plaster and casting tape.
Yeah, exactly. But the defining feature of the TCC is that it is entirely non-removable.
Once it's on, it's on.
Exactly. The clinician carefully molded to the exact contours of the patient's lower leg and foot. And once it sets, the patient is locked in.
Wow.
They sleep in it, they navigate their entire daily routine in it, and they cannot remove it under any circumstances until they return to the clinic to have it literally sawed off.
That is intense. And the control group, they utilized removable offloading interventions, right?
Yes, which generally break down into two categories. You have removable cast walkers. Those are the heavy-duty padded medical boots with Velcro straps.
We've all seen those.
Yeah, and then specialized therapeutic footwear.
Okay, but both the permanent TCC and the removable boots share the exact same biomechanical objective, right? What the literature calls offloading.
That's right. They have to eliminate the physical pressure of the body's weight pressing down on the plantar ulcer.
But here's my question. Gravity still exists. A 200-pound patient still has to walk. How does a fiberglass shell actually redirect that mechanical load away from the bottom of the foot?
It relies on a really clever mechanical trick called the shaft effect.
The shaft effect.
Yeah. Think about it. The human lower leg functions essentially like an inverted cone. It's wider at the calf and tapers down toward the ankle.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So when a clinician applies a total contact cast, they mold the rigid fiberglass tightly against the walls of the lower leg. They really grip the calf muscle and the patellar tendon just below the knee.
Right.
When the patient stands up, the downward force of their body weight is captured by the rigid walls of the cast pressing against the wider parts of the leg.
Oh, wow. So the load is transferred directly into the cast wall and straight down to the floor.
Exactly. It completely bypasses the foot. The foot is essentially just suspended inside the rigid shell, bearing only a tiny fraction of the actual mechanical load.
That is brilliant. But wait, if a removable cast walker is engineered with similar rigid uprights and straps to achieve that exact same shaft effect,
Which they are.
then mechanically, they are built to do the same physical job. Shouldn't they heal the foot at the exact same rate?
You would think so. But when we look at the primary outcomes from those 12 audited studies, the meta-analysis reveals a definitive victory for the permanent total contact cast.
In both the rate and the speed of healing, right?
Yes. Patients in the permanent TCC group demonstrated a risk ratio of 1.22 for ulcer healing, which is a statistically significant advantage over the removable group.
So why does making it permanent magically speed up the biological healing time if the mechanics are the same?
To understand that discrepancy, you have to look past the biomechanics entirely and examine the behavioral data.
Ah, the human element.
Always the human element.
Yeah.
To achieve cellular regeneration in a diabetic foot ulcer, the tissue requires relentless, continuous pressure relief.
What's the threshold for that?
The accepted clinical threshold is that a patient must maintain consistent offloading for a minimum of 80% of their daily activity.
Okay, 80%.
But here's the catch. If a patient wears their device for 23 hours a day, but takes it off to walk barefoot across the house for a few minutes,
Which happens all the time.
all the time, The sheer mechanical trauma of those few unprotected steps can destroy the fragile epithelial cells that we're trying to regenerate.
Just a few steps?
Just a few steps. And this is where the peripheral neuropathy creates a catastrophic psychological trap.
Right, because pain is the body's primary behavioral enforcement mechanism. If I break my ankle, the agonizing pain physically stops me from walking on it.
Exactly. But these patients have lost their protective sensation. They wake up in the middle of the night, they need to go to the kitchen, and that bulky, heavy removable cast is sitting right by the bed.
And because their foot doesn't hurt when they step on it, their brain doesn't receive the danger signal.
Precisely. They skip the boot for convenience, and in 30 seconds of walking, they undo a week of biological healing.
Wow. Does the data actually track how often they take it off?
Oh yeah. The wear time data perfectly illustrates that behavioral failure. Activity monitors placed on patients using removable cast walkers reveal they only wear the devices for an average of 59% of their daily activity.
59%. That's nowhere near the 80% threshold.
Not even close. And for patients prescribed therapeutic footwear, compliance plummets to 50.3%.
That is incredible. Half the time they just aren't using the treatment.
Yeah, because removable devices alter your natural gait. They're cumbersome, they retain heat, and they often cause secondary joint pain in the hips or knees due to the leg length discrepancy.
So without the immediate negative reinforcement of pain, the human desire for physical comfort just overrides the abstract necessity of continuous offloading.
Exactly, which is why the permanent total contact cast generates superior healing outcomes. It achieves 100% enforced compliance.
It completely bypasses human psychology. You literally cannot surrender to the temptation of comfort because the fiberglass shell takes the choice away entirely. Ugh, there's always a but. That permanence has to introduce a new set of risks. You cannot lock an appendage affected by vascular disease inside a dark, rigid shell for weeks at a time without creating secondary problems.
And you would be right. The meta-analysis clearly quantifies that risk. The major drawback of the permanent cast is a significantly higher rate of device-related complications.
How much higher?
The researchers calculated a risk ratio of 1.70 for complications in the permanent cast group.
Okay, what kind of complications are we talking about?
Across the 12 studies, there were 30 specific complications documented in the TCC cohort. 11 of those were mechanical device failures, like instances where the fiberglass cracked or structurally degraded.
And the other 19?
Well, the remaining 13 of note were dermatological, primarily skin abrasions and maceration.
Maceration is nasty. That's what happens when skin is exposed to moisture for prolonged periods. The outermost barrier of the skin absorbs the trapped sweat inside the cast, becomes superhydrated, and physically breaks down.
Yeah, it turns white, softens up, and tears very easily.
Right. So if a tiny fold in the casting tape creates a focal pressure point on a macerated patch of skin, it's just going to rub it raw.
And again, because of the neuropathy, the patient won't feel the skin tearing. They can't feel the abrasion forming.
And because the cast is permanent, they can't even visually inspect the limb to catch the early warning signs.
Exactly. In 6 of the documented cases in the data, this led to secondary wound infections.
So the very mechanism that ensures the primary ulcer heals the inability to remove the device simultaneously creates the ideal environment for treatment-caused injuries to go completely undetected.
Until the cast is sawed off at the clinic,
Yeah.
it is a profound clinical paradox.
It really is. A risk ratio of 1.70 for complications is substantial. But the researchers didn't just leave that number sitting there, did they?
No, they didn't. They conducted a subgroup analysis to see if the control group interventions were universally safer.
And this is where the data tells a much more nuanced story. Let's split that control group into removable casts versus therapeutic footwear.
Right. The subgroup analysis isolates where the complication risk actually spikes. When the permanent cast is compared directly against therapeutic footwear.
The shoes.
Right, the shoes. The risk ratio for complications jumps to 4.81.
Wow. So the permanent cast is nearly 5 times more likely to cause a complication than a therapeutic shoe.
Yes. However, when the TCC is compared strictly against the removable cast walker, the big boot, the risk ratio drops dramatically to 1.27.
Okay, wait. So the difference in complication rates between the permanent cast and the removable cast boot
Is not statistically significant.
that reframes the entire risk profile.
It really does.
The removable cast walkers are creating just as many friction abrasions, pressure points, and instances of maceration as the permanent casts.
Yep. The heavy, rigid structure of the device itself is causing the skin issues regardless of whether it has a Velcro strap or a fiberglass wall.
So the removable casts are causing the same secondary damage, but because the patients are taking them off half the time, they are also failing to heal the primary limb-threatening ulcer.
Exactly. So the meta-analysis forces clinicians to weigh a hierarchy of clinical outcomes.
What's the ultimate verdict then?
On one side, you have the proven capability of the total contact cast to heal the primary ulcer rapidly, thereby preventing an amputation and the 70% mortality risk.
Right.
On the other side, you have the elevated risk of secondary skin complications. Based on this highly distilled data pool, the authors conclude that the total contact cast should firmly remain the gold standard and the primary recommendation.
Which makes sense. You prioritize the prevention of death and amputation above all else.
Always.
But they don't suggest clinicians should just accept maceration as the unavoidable cost of doing business, do they?
No, absolutely not. The researchers pivot from the data to practical mitigation. If we are going to rely on a permanent device that increases complication risks, we have to aggressively engineer that risk out of the process.
Okay, let's unpack this. We aren't just choosing the permanent cast and hoping for the best.
Right.
We're choosing the permanent cast because it guarantees the footrests, and we are neutralizing the complications with better craftsmanship and patient education.
Exactly. The mitigation strategies focus heavily on advanced materials, clinical craftsmanship, and tight protocols.
Like using better fiberglass instead of old plaster.
Yeah, transitioning to advanced polyurethane-coated fiberglass offers higher structural integrity while remaining lighter and more breathable. That cuts down on device failure.
But the materials are secondary to the skill of the clinician applying them, right?
Oh, 100%.
Hmm.
A total contact cast requires meticulous custom contouring. The clinician has to flawlessly apply specialized padding around bony prominences, like the ankle bones.
To ensure the mechanical load is distributed perfectly evenly so no focal pressure points are created inside the rigid shell.
Right. It's basically an artisanal medical skill. You are building a custom weight-bearing exoskeleton.
And even though the patient cannot remove the device, they still have to actively manage it. The sources emphasize relentless patient education.
Yeah, the patient has to understand the mechanics of maceration. They need strict protocols for keeping the cast entirely dry during bathing.
And recognizing secondary signs of infection, too, like unexplained fevers or localized heat radiating through the fiberglass, since they can't rely on pain as an indicator.
Precisely. Furthermore, the clinical protocol demands frequent follow-ups, often weekly or biweekly.
So they literally physically cut the cast off, inspect the skin, debride the primary ulcer, and apply a fresh, perfectly molded cast as the swelling in the leg decreases over time.
Yeah, the protocol recognizes the inherent dangers of the intervention and builds a rigorous framework of observation around it to neutralize those threats.
All to allow the enforced compliance to do its vital work.
Exactly.
So just to summarize our journey today, we started by looking at a catastrophic global health issue, millions of patients facing amputations, and incredibly high mortality rates because neuropathic ulcers simply refuse to heal.
Right.
This meta-analysis sifted through 412 global studies, running them through the Cochrane and Newcastle Ottawa scales to isolate 12 pristine trials.
And those 591 patients proved a really difficult reality.
They did. That the most advanced biomechanical offloading design is practically useless if the patient can take it off when it gets uncomfortable.
Yeah, the behavioral noncompliance is just too strong.
By utilizing the shaft effect inside a permanent fiberglass shell, the total contact cast removes the patient's agency, forces 100% compliance, and achieves significantly higher and faster healing rates.
And the medical community accepts the increased risk of skin issues, choosing to mitigate those risks with superior craftsmanship, because the alternative, relying on human discipline, too often ends in amputation.
It really reframes how we think about treatment. We naturally assume that maintaining our autonomy and having control over our interventions is always the ideal scenario.
We usually demand it, yeah.
But this deep dive proves that in certain high-stakes environments, the absolute best intervention is the one that completely dismantles our ability to self-sabotage.
It's sobering, but the data doesn't lie.
It really makes you wonder, beyond the clinical environment, where else in our lives or our personal habits or our long-term goals are we sacrificing our ultimate success simply because we demand the comfort and convenience of an off switch?
That's a great point. A permanent commitment often carries hidden friction, but it's sometimes the only structural way to ensure the outcome you actually need.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We love taking these dense, critical pieces of research, pulling apart the methodology, and finding the underlying physiological and psychological mechanics that drive the numbers. Keep looking for the why behind the what, and we will see you next time as we plunge into another stack of fascinating research.